Last year, I went over how every single team got from the Season 8 World Championship to the 2022 World Championships, and this year we're going to do the exact same thing. How did every single team get from the 2022 World Championships to the 2023 World Championships? You might think it's a little bit easier of a job since I'm not covering the period from 2019 to 2022, but to be honest, it's really not. Let's get into it. First, we're going to go over the North American teams. We have Gen G Mobile One Racing as our NA number 1 seed. This is apparently Jack, Nolly, and Chronic. This team formed in the 2022 offseason, where apparently Jack came from Dignitas, Nolly came from Core, and Chronic came from Randoms. This team would go on to stick together for the entire year, including winning the Fall Major as their greatest accomplishment, and they come in as the North American 1 seed. North America's number 2 seed is FaZe Clan. You got the roster of First Killer, Sypical, and Mist. This roster last year at Worlds was First Killer, Sypical, and AJ, but AJ was kicked and he would later join Optic. Meanwhile, FaZe Clan picked up Mist from Optic and competed with that roster for the full season. They come into Worlds as the North American 2 seed, despite missing the Spring Major. The North American 3 seed is Complexity. You have AGG, Razebull, and CRR. This roster did not make Worlds last year when it was AGG, Razebull, and Shad, but you might recognize them from their time as True Neutral Death in South America or as Complexity's roster in the Fall Major 2021. That being said, during the offseason, they kicked Shad. He went to Crew Esports, and they would pick up CRR from Guild, also from Europe, to compete with for the whole season. This is their Worlds 2023 roster, and they come in as the North American 3 seed. 4 seed from North America is G2 Esports. You have JNAP, Chicago, and Atomic. And if this roster looks familiar, that's because it very much is. This is the same roster we saw at the 2022 World Championship that was runner-ups. And we'll see if they can produce a similar performance or even top that. 5th seed from North America is Space Station Gaming. You have the roster of Hoxer, Arsenal, and LJ. This looks very different from last year's Space Station roster of Daniel, Arsenal, and Reddles. That's because a day after the World Championship, Space Station announced they were kicking Reddles. He would also go to Optic with AJ, but in Reddles' place, they picked up LJ from Oxygen. They competed with this roster for the fall and winter splits, but when they missed the winter major, Daniel decided to leave to join version 1. Hoxer stepped in his place. This roster made the spring major and competes in the World Championship as the North American 5th seed. And that's it for North America. They're finished. They only have 5 teams at the World Championship this year. What a freaking tragedy. Anyways, on to Europe. Your number 1 seed from Europe is Carmine Core. This is Vatira, Itachi, and Exotic. This team did not follow the 2/3 rule, so I'll cover the Carmine Core we saw in last year's World Championship later. In terms of this team, they were put together in the offseason of 2022. Vatira came from the iconic Moist Esports roster, and Exotic came from Semper, and this team has been dominant in Europe this year, with the exception of the spring split. This team won 3 different regionals. They won the winter major, and they're coming into the World Championship as the European 1 seed. The 2nd seed coming out of Europe is Team Vitality. They have Alpha 54, Redosin, and Zen. This roster won the spring major, the spring invitational, the spring cup, they won everything this spring, but last spring they didn't win anything, and so during the offseason they ended up kicking K-Dop. He would go to Solary. In his place, they picked up Sizen, Redosin's old teammate from Williams Resolve. They competed with this roster for 2 splits, and despite a good showing at the Winter Major, they had also picked up Zen during that offseason, and once his ban expired, he came right in for Sizen. Sizen's currently on Vitality's bench, and now Vitality have the roster of Alpha 54, Redosin, and Zen. They have not lost a single event since picking up Zen, and they are probably tournament favorites heading into this World Championship as the European 2 seed. The European 3 seed this year is Team Liquid. You have a Chronic, a Tau, and Oski, and you might recognize this roster from, well, any of the majors this year, but also the spring major last year, which was their first major competing it as a team. It was also their first split competing as a team, so they weren't able to get enough points in spring to make the World Championship last year. This year, with a full season under their belt, they're easily able to do it, and they end up as the European 3 seed heading into Germany. The defending world champions Team BDS come in as their European 4th seed. You have Monkey Moon, Rise, and Seiko. Last year, the world championship winning roster was Monkey Moon, Extra, and Seiko. So if you're wondering why a roster change was made for the defending world championship, well, they competed with this roster for the fall and winter splits, and they didn't make either major. They decided, hey, we want Rise. Rise was available. They benched Extra. Rise came in from Oxygen, and now this roster is competing for the world championship. They sneaked into the main event given their performance in the spring major, and they're looking to go back-to-back. Your European 5th seed is Moist Esports with Juicy, Joyo, and Cash. If you think this looks a lot different than last year's Moist Esports roster, it's because it is. Last year you had Rise, Joyo, and Vatira in one of the most iconic rosters in RL Esports history, but Vatira left after their quarterfinal exit because he decided he wanted to speak French. He would join Carmine Core, which is the perfect place to speak French. And in this place, Moist Esports picked up Astral. This team competed in the fall major. They ended up going to the grand finals before losing, and it was at this point that Rise decided to start his team hopping journey. He would join Oxygen during the winter transfer window, and in his place, Moist would pick up Juicy. Now, this team did not make the Winter Major, and after that, they decided Astro was gone. Astro still sitting on the Moist Esports bench, and in his place, they picked up the Cannon and Cash from Quadrant. They made the Spring Major. They had a good top 6 run, and they're your European 5th seed heading into the World Championship. Your 6th seed coming out of Europe is Oxygen. They have Archie, Jorias, and Ixo. If you think this looks different from any roster you've ever seen, it's because they were formed in the 2022 offseason. Archie came from Endpoint, who also came from Semper. It was a loan situation. It was weird. He's on Oxygen now. They also picked up Jorias from Dignitas and Oli from Solary. That may or may not rhyme. I can't really tell. But they competed with this roster for the fall, and then they decided to kick Oli on the last day of the transfer window when they figured out that Rise wasn't going to North America. Rise joined in their place from Moist, and they competed with this roster for approximately one split. They still made the Winter Major. They got top 12, and then Rise said, I'm jumping teams again. He left to join Team BDS, and in his place, they picked up Ixo from Quadrant, and they competed with this roster for the spring. They didn't make the Spring Major, but they're still the 6th seed heading into the World Championship. And with a new logo. They do have a new logo as well. Your 7th seed out of Europe for the World Championship is the roster of G1. You have Atomic, Dorito, and Oli. They were formed in the 2022 offseason when they had Atomic come from Luminosity, Dorito from Guild, and Mark by 8 from the bench of Team BDS. This team competed together for the fall and the winter splits. They made the Winter Major. They ended up going last in their group after a disappointing loss to Crew, and they decided to kick Mark by 8. He remains on the bench for another World Championship. I mean, this guy needs a team for the World Championships. Please, somebody. Anyways, they picked up Oli from Oxygen. He was on Oxygen's bench at the time. They did not make the Spring Major, but they managed to squeak in as the European 7th seed as North America is absolutely in the gutter right now. The OCE team's going to the World Championship. You only have 2 of them yet again this year, and there was still a big 3 in OCE, so it's kind of surprising, but we'll get to that team that missed in just a second. The teams that made it, the first one being the Pioneers. You have the OCE 1 seed. It's Scrub, Banana Head, and Hunter. Last year you had Scrub, Banana Head, and Super Locky, and they had this roster for the fall split as well. But at the fall major, they had a disappointing 0-9 game record, I believe, and they decided Super Locky was gone. He would go to ground 0, and they picked up the young mechanical Hunter in his place from the Lake Show. They competed with this roster for the winter and spring splits. They did not make the spring major, but that was mainly because Hunter was unable to play on Championship Sunday for the last 2 events. They were very close to making it, but they're still have enough points to secure the OCE 1 seed, and you will see them at the World Championship with their full roster. The 2 seed out of OCE is Power. You have Anthus, Fever, and Torsos. This is Anthus' first World Championship somehow. Last year in spring, you had Anthus, Express, and Torsos. They barely missed out of the World Championship when it came down to the wire at the Spring Major last year. And after that, Express decided he was going to retire. In his place, they got Fever from Renegades, and they competed with his roster for the full season. And this is your World's 2023 roster for Power. Let's get into the South American teams. The first seed out of South America is Ninja Pajamas. You have Astromic, Bems, and Mata. This team actually follows the 2/3 rule all the way back to the club roster of last year, which was Astromic, KV1, and Lost. Right after the World Championship, the team decided to kick KV1. He would go on to Team Secret, and in his place, they picked up Bems from Crew Esports. This team won all 3 online events in South America in the fall split, but had a very disappointing fall major for their standards. And it was at this point that Lost left. He went to Furia in North America, and in his place, it was actually a 1-for-1 transfer, and Kaio TG1 came over from Furia. They also, at this time, got picked up by Ninjas of Pajamas, and they were a little disappointing in winter. They didn't make the winter major, but they did win the winter invitational, and despite having a most recent win under their belt, they did end up kicking Kaio. During the spring transfer window, they picked up Mata in his place from Parabellum Esports, and they made it back to LAN with the pickup of Mata. They were able to upset Furia and get themselves into the main event of the World Championship, and they are running with this roster at Worlds. Second seed out of South America is Crew Esports. You have Brad Drufino and Drops. This team was actually formed in the 2022 offseason. They did not follow the 2/3 rule from Crew Esports roster last year. They decided to build around Drufino, and then Shad came from Complexity in North America, and Drops came from Bailao Esports, I believe. Don't sue me if I got that wrong. I apologize if I did. This team competed together for the fall split, but after losing the tiebreaker to Team Secret, they ended up kicking Shad. He would go teamless for a split, and in his place, they would pick up a guy who rhymed with him, Brad. They picked up Brad from Endgame. They competed with this roster for the winter and spring splits, making both the majors, and they're coming in to the wild card as South America's 2nd seed. The third and final team coming out of South America is Team Secret. You have Sad, KV1, and Knight on this roster. Last year, Team Secret participated at the World Championship with a roster of Sad, Math, and Knight. And despite the fact that Math had made every single RLCS land since Season 8, they ended up kicking him during the offseason. He would go teamless for a bit, I believe, as well. And in his place, they picked up KV1 from the club. They competed with his roster for the entire season. They made a top 4 run at Rotterdam. They most recently missed the spring major, but they are the 3 seed heading into the World Championship for South America. Now we're moving on to the MENA teams going to the World Championship. The first seed out of MENA is Rule 1. They managed to sneak themselves into the main event due to their performance at the Spring Major, which guaranteed a third seed out of MENA going to World Championship. The Rule 1 roster, however, is Rawas, Clears, and Maassen. This team did really well at the Spring Split, but they started by forming in the 2022 offseason. Rawas and Clears came from the team called F16 Esports. They competed at Gamers 8, but they did not compete in the last season of RLCS. These guys are actually twins, if you are not aware, and they were able to pick up Natter during the offseason. They were looking to pick up Nuepo, but he did get a one-year competitive ban, so they competed with Natter for the fall split. They got picked up by Rule 1 during the fall split, and during the winter transfer, they ended up saying goodbye to Natter, and in his place, they picked up Maassen from Twisted Minds. This was their winter roster and actually was their spring roster as well, although they did pick up AMS to sit on the bench, and they are coming in to the World Championship as the 1 seed out of MENA. Second seed out of MENA is the very recognizable Team Falcons. You have Khaled, Ahmed, and TRK, and this is one of the 2 rosters that did not change from last year's World Championship. They're entering this year's World Championship as the 2 seed from MENA. The third seed out of MENA is Twisted Minds. You have Senzo, SMW, and Venom on this team. They actually did follow the 2/3 rule from last year's World Championship where they flew under the banner of Veloce. That was a roster of Senzo, SMW, and Twiz, but during the offseason, they ended up kicking Twiz. He would go to Geek Esports, and in his place, they picked up Basil from F16 Esports. He played with the Twins at Gamers 8. Please don't sue me if I got that name wrong. I think it's Basil. Please don't quote me on that. They competed with this roster for 2 splits. During the fall split, they competed under the banner of Veloce, but during the winter split, they competed under the banner of Vision Esports. But after the winter split, they ended up kicking Basil. He would go to Espada, and in his place, they would pick up Venom. Now, they ended up getting the org Twisted Minds as well, and they competed with this roster for the spring split and managed to sneak into the World Championship despite not qualifying for a single LAN yet this season. Now we're moving on to the Asia Pacific teams. There are 2 teams coming out of APAC this season. The first one being Elevate, which may or may not come out of APAC depending on your viewpoint. While Realize is from Japan, you have Virtuoso coming from Ireland and Kami coming from OCE. This was the fabled APAC super team that was formed at the beginning of the year. Virtuoso came from Navi, Realize from Tokyo Verde, and Kami from Renegades. They flew under the banner of James Cheese for the first split and then eventually got picked up by Elevate heading into the winter and spring splits. They did miss the winter major, but they still are coming in as the APAC first seed to the World Championship. Second seed out of APAC at this World Championship is Gladiators. This is the roster of LCT, Maxu, and OSM. At Worlds 2022, they were the roster of LCT, Maxu, and Abs Crazy. If you don't remember Abs Crazy, it's because he didn't actually make it to the World Championship last year due to visa issues, and instead Commutator played in his place. During the offseason, Abs Crazy ended up leaving for another team that was called Blue Abstick, I believe. In his place, they picked up OSM. They competed with this roster for the entirety of the season. They made the Winter Major ahead of the APAC Super Team and are competing with this roster at the World Championship. Now, I know there's rumors flying around this roster where LCT is going to be let go after this season. No, Sigums is not playing from the bench. They are starting LCT at the World Championship. And the last region coming into this World Championship is Sub-Saharan Africa. They got 2 teams going as well. The first one being the super team of Limitless. This is a roster of Snowy, To Die For, and Darth. We saw this team under the banner of Orlando Pirates at the last year's World Championship with a roster of Snowy, Skillsteel, and Darth. But after Worlds, they ended up kicking Skillsteel. He went to Reformed, and in his place, they picked up To Die For. They went under the roster of May Contain Nuts for a bit before they got picked up by Limitless ahead of the Fall Invitational, but they competed with this roster for the entirety of the season and are coming into Worlds as the SSA 1 seed. The SSA 2 seed is flying under the banner of Valiant now. This is Werty, Wilu, and Sweaty. You may recognize Sweaty as Sweaty Clarence if you pay attention to SSA, but during the 2022 offseason, this roster was formed and they flew under the banner of ATK. At the time, it was Werty, Wilu, and Gyazao, I believe is how his name is pronounced. Please don't sue me if I don't know these names. They competed with this roster for the fall split, but then Gyazao was kicked. Gyazao was formerly the coach of ATK, but he ended up getting kicked after competing for a split, and in his place, they picked up Galaxy. They competed with this roster for just the winter split, still under ATK, but after that, they ended up kicking Galaxy, and they went under the name of French Class. In his place, they picked up Sweaty Clarence, and they managed to make a push during the absolute last moment during the Spring Invitational. They made the finals to secure their ticket to the 2023 World Championship. They've gotten picked up by Valiant since then, and they're headed in as the SSA 2 seed. For the teams that did not make it, we have several teams that were at last year's World Championship that did not manage to qualify for this year's World Championship. I'll also be going all the teams that went to majors this year that did not make it. The first one, I'm sorry, it's NRG. It's Justin, Garrett, Squishy. They stuck with their roster for the entire year. They almost had a good run in spring, but they couldn't get it done, and NRG ended up missing this year's World Championship. Second team we have is version 1. Last year, they flew under the roster of Beast Mode, Calm, and Torment, and they competed with this roster for 2 splits this year. They made the Fall Major, but ended up missing the Winter Major after a whole Rise transfer saga ended up going completely awry. After the Winter split, they ended up kicking Torment. He ended up retiring, and in his place, they picked up Daniel. This was the fabled North American super team starting to form with Daniel and Beast Mode finally on the same team together, but they ended up missing the Spring Major despite their super team status, and we will not see them at this year's World Championship. The third roster we got to go over is Optic Gaming, and while we might see Optic later in this video with a different banner, last year at the World Championship, they had Illusion, Drees, and Mist. This team completely went separate ways during the offseason. Illusion went into a coaching role with Gen G, Drees went over to Dignitas, and Mist ended up going to FaZe Clan, so this team no longer exists, and Optic picked up a whole new squad of 3 different players. First team out of Europe that did not make the World Championship after making it last year was Team Endpoint. You had Archie, Relating Wave, and Metzenaris on this roster last year. And similar to Optic, everyone went their separate ways during the 2022 offseason. Archie would move on to go to Oxygen, Relating Wave would go to Quadrant, and Metzenaris would go to a team named Finnish Dutchman, which in hindsight is really sad because Metzenaris is now retired, and that is the end of his career, unfortunately. But this was the Endpoint roster that did not end up making it this year. That's a sad note to end on. I'm sorry, guys. Dignitas' roster last year also blew up during the offseason. They had apparently Jack Jurias and Scrubkilla during the World 2022, and they all went their separate ways. Apparently, Jack went on to Gen G, Jurias to join Archie at Oxygen, and Scrubkilla went to SK, so it was SK for a bit. He ended up never making a regional with SK, but he did make regionals on the Team Hogan mode in the spring split, if you recognize their run. Carmine Corps did not follow the 2/3 rule, so I got him here. Last year, they flew with the roster of Astral, Itachi, and Nolly. This roster went their separate ways, but Carmine Corps ended up building around Itachi. Astral would go to Moist Esports, and Nolly would go to Gen G. Semper is our last team out of Europe that made the World Championship last year and disbanded over the offseason. They had the roster of Exotic, Cassio, and Shawset, but during the offseason, everyone went their separate ways, with Exotic going on to Carmine Corps, Cassio going to Tundra, and Shawset going to Solary. First team out of OCE that disbanded was Renegades. You had CJ, Fever, and Kami. During the offseason, CJ would go on to join Rizzo on Chalked Cast, while Fever would join Power and Kami would join Elevates. Furia is the team that did the best at last year's World Championship that did not end up making it this year. Last year, they flew with the roster of Card, Kaio, and Yan. They competed with this roster for the fall split in North America after moving out of South America, but when they didn't make the fall major, they ended up kicking Kaio. He would move on to play for Ninjas in Pajamas in the next split, but in his place, they picked up Lost from the club. They competed with this roster for the rest of the season, and they ended up making the Spring Major after winning the Spring Invitational, but they ended up going 0-2 in series and missing out on the World Championship. Now we're moving on to Middle East, North Africa, and the only team to not follow the 2/3 rule from a roster last year was O1 Esports. Last year, they had Zazonix, AMS, and Mawson. During the fall split, they competed with the same exact roster under the banner of Twisted Minds, but after the fall split, Mawson would lead to join Rule 1, and in his place, Tom would end up coming in. I believe it's called Tom. It's the same kind of syllable as Mawson with the 7. Tom would come in from Geek Esports. They competed with this roster for the winter split, but after the winter split, AMS would end up joining Rule 1's bench, and in his place, they would pick up Mesho from Mountains. They also got a new organization in Geek Esports, and this roster ended up missing out on the World Championship by 1 spot. They were the MENA 4 seed. Last year out of APAC, we had the Senbei Strikers. They were also known as Tokyo Verde for the entire season, but for some reason, there was something going on with the org at the time, so I do still have the Tokyo Verde logo. During the offseason, everyone went their separate ways. Realize would go on to Elevate. Tenhao would kind of disappear. I think he retired, and Sigums would go on to Tough Love. The last team we have out of the 2022 World Championship is Bravado Gaming. This was a roster of Daisy, Happy Meal, and To Die For. During the offseason, Daisy would end up rebranding to Cams. No, I got this wrong last year. Cam and Daisy were actually the same person. A couple of people told me in the comments. Now they're going under the name of Cams, and hopefully we won't have any more confusion on this front, but at this point, who really knows? During the offseason, though, along with the rebrand, To Die For ended up leaving to join the SSA Super Team. In his place, they picked up Eliakim ZA. They competed under the banner of Orlando Pirates with this roster for the fall and winter splits. But in a push to make the World Championship, they ended up kicking Eliakim. He would go to Apex, and in his place, it was a 1-for-1 trade from Apex, and they picked up Shadow. They almost made the World Championship with this roster, but were 1 point behind, and they missed out. So yeah, unfortunate for them. Now we're moving on to teams that made majors this year but did not make the World Championship. The first one being Quadrant out of Europe. This was a roster of EXO, Relating Wave, and Cash. They made the fall major together. They were formed in the 2022 offseason with EXO coming from Luminosity, Relating Wave from Endpoint, and Cash from Misfits. but they ended up losing the winter tiebreaker, and so they did not stick together. Everyone went their separate ways during the spring transfer window, with Ixo going to Oxygen, Cash going to Moist, and Relating Wave unfortunately riding the bench for Quadrant. Dignitas is back, and this time they're actually back in North America. You have Andy, Drees, and Evo on this roster. They made the Winter Major in the most stacked North America season to date. How did this happen? Well, they started with the roster of Andy, Drees, and Delta during the 2022 offseason. They had Andy from Sonics, Drees from Optic, and Delta from Stromboli. They competed with this roster only for the fall split because there was a little bit of confusion during the transfer window. They thought they were going to get Zanil. They didn't get Zanil. They got Delta instead. And so after the fall was disappointing, they ended up kicking Delta. He would go to Boulevard. And in their place, they ended up picking up Evo at the last day of the transfer window. They competed with this roster for 2 splits, including making that Winter Major, but they did not gather enough points. They ended up getting 10th in North America and are staying at home from this World Championship. Now, just like last year, OCU was a 3-horse race, and unfortunately, Ground Zero got the short end of the stick. This year, they had the Winter Major roster of Super Locky, Fiber, and Kaka, and this team actually formed during the winter transfer window of this year. Super Locky had gotten kicked off of Pioneers, Fiber had come from placeholders, and Kaka was already on Ground Zero. They formed with 0 points, made an amazing run, making both the winter and spring majors. But during the spring major, they had to face against Power, and the winner of that would go to the World Championship, while the loser ended up having to stay home. Unfortunately, Ground Zero lost that series, and they were the 3rd best team out of OCE this year. But it was impressive that they were able to gather enough points in just 2 splits to even contend for that spot. And last but not least, we have Optic Gaming, who made the spring major, Reddles, AJ, and Magic Bear, and you had to trust the process to believe this team would even be in this video, but they managed to make it happen. They were formed in the 2022 offseason when Reddles got kicked by Space Station, AJ got kicked by FaZe, and they ended up picking up Magic Bear from Torrent. They competed with this roster for the entire season and finally made a major in the spring, but were just short of making the World Championship. And that's it. We've been through every single team. Vivor's is gone. My spirit is high. Unfortunately, we don't have overtime yet, but we might on August 3rd when the World Championship starts. Be sure to tune in. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you then.